the new God of eternal death, the new gods of eternal deaths, a new God of eternal death, the new goddess of eternal death, the new goddesses of eternal deaths, a new goddess of eternal death, the old God of eternal death, the old gods of eternal deaths, a old God of eternal death, the old goddess of eternal death, the old goddesses of eternal deaths, a old goddess of eternal death, the greater God of eternal death, the greater gods of eternal deaths, a greater God of eternal death, the greater goddess of eternal death, the greater goddesses of eternal deaths, a greater goddess of eternal death, the lesser God of eternal death, the lesser gods of eternal deaths, a lesser God of eternal death, the lesser goddess of eternal death, the lesser goddesses of eternal deaths, a lesser goddess of eternal death, the greater spirit of eternal death, the greater spirits of eternal deaths, a greater spirit of eternal death, the lesser spirit of eternal death, the lesser spirits of eternal deaths, a lesser spirit of eternal death, the major God of eternal death, the major gods of eternal deaths, a major God of eternal death, the major goddess of eternal death, the major goddesses of eternal deaths, a major goddess of eternal death, the minor God of eternal death, the minor gods of eternal deaths, a minor God of eternal death, the minor goddess of eternal death, the minor goddesses of eternal deaths, a minor goddess of eternal death, the superior God of eternal death, the superior gods of eternal deaths, a superior God of eternal death, the superior goddess of eternal death, the superior goddesses of eternal deaths, a superior goddess of eternal death, the inferior God of eternal death, the inferior gods of eternal deaths, a inferior God of eternal death, the inferior goddess of eternal death, the inferior goddesses of eternal deaths, a inferior goddess of eternal death, the ancestor God of eternal death, the ancestor gods of eternal deaths, a ancestor God of eternal death, the ancestor goddess of eternal death, the ancestor goddesses of eternal deaths, a ancestor goddess of eternal death, the ascendant God of eternal death, the ascendant gods of eternal deaths, a ascendant God of eternal death, the ascendant goddess of eternal death, the ascendant goddesses of eternal deaths, a ascendant goddess of eternal death, the descendant God of eternal death, the descendant gods of eternal deaths, a descendant God of eternal death, the descendant goddess of eternal death, the descendant goddesses of eternal deaths, a descendant goddess of eternal death, the transcendent God of eternal death, the transcendent gods of eternal deaths, a transcendent God of eternal death, the transcendent goddess of eternal death, the transcendent goddesses of eternal deaths, a transcendent goddess of eternal death, the future God of eternal death, the future gods of eternal deaths, a future God of eternal death, the future goddess of eternal death, the future goddesses of eternal deaths, a future goddess of eternal death, the present God of eternal death, the present gods of eternal deaths, a present God of eternal death, the present goddess of eternal death, the present goddesses of eternal deaths, a present goddess of eternal death, the past God of eternal death, the past gods of eternal deaths, a past God of eternal death, the past goddess of eternal death, the past goddesses of eternal deaths, a past goddess of eternal death, the God of eternal death, the gods of eternal deaths, a God of eternal death, the goddess of eternal death, the goddesses of eternal deaths, a goddess of eternal death, the half God of eternal death, the half gods of eternal deaths, a half God of eternal death, the half goddess of eternal death, the half goddesses of eternal deaths, a half goddess of eternal death, the vessel of eternal death, the vessels of eternal deaths, a vessel of eternal death, the person of eternal death, the persons of eternal deaths, a person of eternal death, the image of eternal death, the images of eternal deaths, a image of eternal death, the imagination of eternal death, the imaginations of eternal deaths, a imagination of eternal death, the belief of eternal death, the beliefs of eternal deaths, a belief of eternal death, the thought of eternal death, the thoughts of eternal deaths, a thought of eternal death, the word of eternal death, the words of eternal deaths, a word of eternal death, the action of eternal death, the actions of eternal deaths, a action of eternal death, the reaction of eternal death, the reactions of eternal deaths, a reaction of eternal death, the situation of eternal death, the situations of eternal deaths, a situation of eternal death, the circumstance of eternal death, the circumstances of eternal deaths, a circumstance of eternal death, the relationship of eternal death, the relationships of eternal deaths, a relationship of eternal death, the number of eternal death, the numbers of eternal deaths, a number of eternal death, the formula of eternal death, the formulas of eternal deaths, a formula of eternal death, the equation of eternal death, the equations of eternal deaths, a equation of eternal death, the symbol of eternal death, the symbols of eternal deaths, a symbol of eternal death, the color of eternal death, the colors of eternal deaths, a color of eternal death, the thing of eternal death, the things of eternal deaths, a thing of eternal death, the way of eternal death, the ways of eternal deaths, a way of eternal death, the place of eternal death, the places of eternal deaths, a place of eternal death, the time of eternal death, the times of eternal deaths, a time of eternal death, the event of eternal death, the events of eternal deaths, a event of eternal death, the result of eternal death, the results of eternal deaths, a result of eternal death,